Thank you very much, and I'm glad you're still here. It's always a surprise after coffee break, and especially because there are no drinks offered, so glad you're still here with me. Well, I want to discuss in more detail the elements of new heritage and new heritage paradigms, which have to do, what I believe, with the major transformations of our city. And a lot has been said about these transformations, and especially the city where I work and live, Rotterdam, is, I could say, a very fine place to test because of its transnational population. What do we mean with transnational city? And I wrote down a definition which I use, which I think it's not the only thing you can say about transnationalism, but to be specific for my purposes, and I hope the purposes of the museum, it means to me that we are dealing with urban dynamic situation, but transnationalism is a part of self-awarenesses of city and has to do with representations. And all three of them are shaped and reshaped by the fact that there is a multi-diverse population. Multi-diverse, for instance, in the case of Rotterdam, within 5 or 10 years, almost 50% of its inhabitants will have a non-Dutch origin. So that means when we are discussing heritage of the future, we have to deal with this fact. Secondly, it means that when there are transnational relationships, and Søren had this morning told about the great major challenges of urban history as an academic discipline, then we must consider the fact that we have to deal with cities, with populations, whose social, cultural and economic relations are not necessarily confined to the nation or city of residence. When you accept this is something you have to deal with as a modern city museum, then you realize that there's a huge task for us. And it means that we have to reconsider not only the heritage point of view, but at the same time, what kind of qualifications are needed in this new city museum. Before that, I want to stress that what I mean with transnational heritage is not the same as seeking for heritage of migrant communities. To put it bluntly, I'm not so interested in the oranges, the country of oranges, but I'm looking for traces of diversity within the city and how these traces of diversity reflect upon urban culture. There are three things I like to discuss. Firstly, I want to shortly discuss some of my reconsiderations with heritage. Secondly, I want to discuss the increasing role of emotions in our heritage discussions and what does it mean for our future heritage concepts. And thirdly, I'd like to address some issues which have to deal with new heritage expertise. It's not all an academic lecture because I want to show you some of the examples of our case studies we are running in Rotterdam at this very moment, and some of the ideas which are addressed by me are dealt with in the case studies. And when I start the case studies, there will be a flow of slides coming all over you. You just sit down, relax and enjoy because it's entertainment time as well. So, briefly, of course I know this slide is something with a lamp, but it's some of the aspects have been discussed this morning, so I can be very brief. These are very rude qualifications, but in general, you could say that before the 1970s, the cultural museums in general, were still based on the traditional heritage concept. Object is central. It means that we all, you could say, evolved from antiquity rooms into cultural historical museums. The role of the public there was just addressing them as a means of the museum was of a patrician kind, and what we are presenting were the kind of values, of heritage values and ideals of a bourgeois community. Those were leading examples. In the 1960s, 1970s, and I think a very influential group has been a social history group, means that the object is still valued, but we are transferring culture, knowledge is still central, but because of the influence of social history, oral history, we are gradually accepting the fact that tangible and intangible heritage, immaterial heritage, are relevant as well. So it's not only about the authentic artifacts. But then, at the same time, the public is still passive. But from the 1990s onwards, I see you slowly moving away from this passive attitudes. First of all, the public demands to be entertained. Entertainment and heritage experiences, I think, become leading marketing and communication strategies in museums. But now, beyond 2000s, and for us as museum, I think this is the most interesting period, because I'm in the middle of this, I think, process, and I think that we have to redefine, and now I'm discussing it in terms of a heritage chain, meaning tangible, intangible, and emotional heritage, and I will come to that later. And the second part is there a future role of the museum, and that's why there, I believe, is a paradigm change, and I think some of you have discussed this before, and I think it's essential. But then what is the role of the public? You can say, well, the public will become or should become an active participant, being a member of social and thus the heritage community. That means he is asking for a greater role, not only a role as being a visitor, being entertained, but at the same time he wants to get involved in the kind of entertainment offered to him in the museum. And in this respect, I make a distinction between the glamour heritage and the cohesion heritage. And I think glamour heritage, that's the heritage by the very huge museum halls. These are the museum halls of the art history. These are the interesting big buildings, and these are the museums which take away most of the media attention, and of course these are the museums discussed about because they have added value in terms of market value. These are the museums followed by observers, critical journalists, but especially the guys from Sotheby's and Christie's. That is where the money flows and not necessarily the good ideas. So, before I think in this concept of new heritage, I think there are four relevant ideas. First of all, when I discuss heritage in our context, I'm referring to heritage as a dynamic interpretation, meaning that I want to make, you could say, a distinction between nostalgia, so I'm not a nostalgia seeker, because nostalgia is only concerned for a particular community and it's more related to exclusion. When your memory is not part of that nostalgia, one way or the other you are excluded. So I'm looking for the working memory. So heritage is hard work. So that's the first thing. So I'm not after nostalgia, I'm after dynamic interpretation, meaning they should be relevant for the city life of today. Secondly, is cohesion heritage, meaning that I'm looking for heritage as, you could say, heritage in a sense of belonging, interpretation by communities. And for that, within this respect, I'm referring to the definition of heritage by the European Commission, saying that's the Faro Convention, Cultural heritage is a group of resources inherited from the past which people identify independently of ownership as a reflection and expression of their constantly evolving values, beliefs, knowledge and tradition. It includes all aspects of the environment resulting from the interaction between people and places through time. You could say this is typical European Commission prose, but I think it's relevant because it means that although it complicates the working field of museums considerably, the heritage concept is relevant because it tells us that in order to be relevant, in order to safeguard heritage, we have to move it on to next generations, unless next generations, these heritage communities simply say, well, there is no use for this heritage. And the point I'd like to make in this respect is there, especially for European city museums, that is the aspect of mental heritage. And mental heritage refers to intangible, but more than that. Why I think is this concept important for us as city museums? Because it's stimulated by, you could say, a mutual sensibility. This is not my term, it's from a French philosopher, but it means that, and we have seen some examples this morning, social media, Twitter, Facebook, all these websites, everybody uploading stories, uploading films, uploading photos, and so on. Everybody wants to create its own museum. This is what people really like to do. Meaning that users of internet create their own worlds. And what does it mean for us as museum curators? That means that these people from outside are really challenging our, you could say, authority. This is quite different from the situations until the 1990s and 2000s, when you said, I'm a museum professional and what I'm telling you is the truth and nothing but the truth, and you're not entitled to interfere with my core business. I think this internet and social media has changed the role of curatorship in general. You could say that the digital age has definitely shaken up our positions, and new web applications and so on, interactive dedicated collection websites, will break up the institutional barriers of the museum for good. And I think that's a great idea, because what does it mean? That the city doesn't stop once you enter the museum. You can say it's almost the very small particulars from which create enough energy, and we all have to wait the moment they collide and new things, new energy is as a result of that. So, for instance, this museal sensibility is, for instance, described by Husserl, is the obsessive self-musealization per video recorder, memoir writing, confessional literature, and if you add to that the electronic totalization of the world on databanks, is written down before internet, then the museum can indeed no longer be described as a single institution with stable and well-drawn boundaries. So that means that the public, you can say, it's a democratic situation. The public is literally breaking up our authenticity, authorships, our professional integrity. But there's more than that, because you're not only involved in what a curator is doing, but at the same time, you can say we are creating a sense of self-curatorship. Because once you have the tools, you not only want to let your voice hear, but you want to get involved. You want to say it rather bluntly, you want to make as public, you want to make your own exhibitions. And because of internet, it's nowadays possible everybody to make his own exhibitions. And I think that's another, I think for the transnational heritage, important issue is that transnational heritage, because of the cultural contrasts in our multi-diverse societies, that our heritage is framed by emotions and intercultural non-dialogues. Meaning that when we are all creating a kind of separate spheres in our urban societies, not because we want to, but because it's imposed on us, because we are afraid of otherness. I think an influential work is written down by the French philosopher Dominique Moisy, The Geopolitics of Emotion. And I think this work he has not written down this work in order to enhance the quality and professionalization of curatorship, but once I read this book, I said, well, he has a point, and maybe we as curators have to think of other aspects of heritage beyond the tangible heritage. We all accepted the object. We were invented to create the object, originally as a museum. Secondly, we now accept it because of the social history groups. We accepted the intangible heritage part. But what are we doing? What kind of heritage is the result of intercultural non-dialogues and all kind of emotions within a transnational community? And I think when you look at his forecast on what happens in the 21st century, he thinks, Dominique Moisy thinks, well, the geopolitics is based on emotions. The Western Hemisphere is confronted with the Eastern part. It has nothing to do with social and economic conflicts, but it's about fear. We are afraid of the other. And this notion of being afraid, especially the public fear of the Islamization of Western society, responds upon the way we are behaving towards each other in our society. And I think some of the reactions of minority groups in big cities reflect upon these issues. For instance, in my own field research, when I come across, for instance, I'm field work and I'm confronting first generation guest workers. And when I ask them and I want to confront them with their history, and when I behave like the traditional curator, I would just ask, oh, please give me your suitcase when you came here, because we are collecting things. And okay, well, we can accept your stories and maybe your letters as well, but oh, that's enough for us. But when you discuss the way he lives in this society, he is totally not interested in this suitcase. He doesn't have any suitcase from his first period. He's not interested in the bunk beds he slept in the 1960s, 1970s. He's not interested in the letters. But what is interested? He says, I'm interested that I'm losing my disrespect in a society because I am looked upon as, you can say, as a former labor migrant who is now out of work. And nobody is asking me why I'm out of work, because he was cleaning tankers in the 1960s without any protective means. So when you start cleaning tankers and you do this work for 10 or 15 years, then you shouldn't be surprised that when you are 50 that your lungs are rotten, then your kidneys are almost away, your liver does not function, and so then when you're out of work, this is no surprise. And these people tell me, so I won't go back to Turkey. Why should I go back to Turkey? Because in Turkey they cannot take care of me. So I stay here. And as a consequence, I am not behaved, not treated with any respect. And in my discussion with these migrants, I found out that a lot of these discussions on how they are disrespected by our society, are, you can say, passed over to the next generation. So when I want to make a clear picture of what's happening to our urban society of today, I have to take into account these issues as well. So city curators should incorporate the mental heritage parts in their contemporary collecting schemes when they are dealing with migration and transnationalism in an urban context. So this brings me to combining all these factors, and I say, well, okay, I still accept that the city museum is a museum for an urban knowledge center. But perhaps it's a different urban knowledge we need, especially when we are focusing on contemporary society. And in the case of Rotterdam, which is of course very different from Ghent, you can say we should look for unique positions of our city. For instance, when we are dealing as a city museum, although Rotterdam was founded in the medieval times, it does not make sense to confront our visitors with Rotterdam's golden age. We do not have to invest in attracting tourists to Rotterdam. So I said, well, let's forget about the tourists, because tourists, when they come to Rotterdam, they're not interested in going to that museum of a classical bourgeois paradigm. When they want to look at golden age collections, they all go to Amsterdam, they take the bus to Delft and all other places of the Golden Triangle. So we should now seek our unique selling position in the modern society. But we have to develop urban knowledge, because it's a strange idea that sometimes people think that the public becoming more important means that you should get rid of your research qualifications. I think it's not. And Janet Marstein, she wrote a book on the postmodern museum, is very specific in this respect, and I'd like to quote her. She says, the new heritage agenda calls for new research strategies in city museums. Becoming a more democratic museum does not imply that the museum should give up its scholarship, but, open quote, instead that engages in research that has resonance for the communities it serves. So this brings me to the second base of the, you could say, the triangle, and it means, in line with the aspects of the Faro European Commission definition, we should do research in relationship with our urban, and I call it heritage communities. And then the third part, what kind of representations are needed? Because you have to be in balance, the three of us. And I will come to the representations aspect later on. So this means, what is the role of the urban curator in this sense? We become heritage brokers. And that means that we need new qualifications. But, for instance, when you look at the scholarship of urban curators, city curators, for instance, when you want to become a professional, you want to follow a museum career, then you follow, for instance, the master education and at the University of Amsterdam, and when you look at the curricula, it's as if everybody is trained to become a professional curator at the Rijksmuseum or any art museum. But we need new kind of qualifications, and I think qualifications such as urban anthropology. And I'd like to address the issue put forward by the American non-profit organization. It's simply called Urban and Anthropology, and they speak of a kind of public anthropology. And what it says, I quote, "It's primarily public anthropology, an effort to use anthropological theory, methods and research to help the public understand urban cultures, constructively address their problems and celebrate their achievements." End of quote. So if you use this concept in your new heritage paradigm, then you have all the ingredients, and then you can say, well, let's start doing the work. And now I will present some of the case studies in Rotterdam and some of the aspects we've done research since 2007. I will present to you in a slideshow. First of all, for those of you who are not familiar with the city of Rotterdam, of course Rotterdam is a city of 600,000 people, which is not much for a big city. But keep in mind that this is all part of Rotterdam with independent cities, but you can say the influence of Rotterdam stretches beyond the city towards the sea. It's an area about 40 kilometers, meaning that you can say this port economy, this labor economy is really the dominant part of this area, meaning that this region totalizes about 1 million people. And most people of Rotterdam, especially those who were born in Rotterdam, have settled in the 1960s, 1970s in all these suburbs and neighborhoods. To give you an idea that Rotterdam is not in one, I think it's not nice to say, but Rotterdam is a poor city. It's therefore an interesting city for me to study. But look at these, this is socio-economic status of the city of Rotterdam 2006. And you can imagine, if you want to address a bourgeois heritage agenda, then you are only referring to people living in this area, in these neighborhoods, with a high socio-economic status. So they actually run the museum, they started the museum and gave all their bourgeois objects and artifacts towards the museum. So, but this is real Rotterdam. This is Rotterdam South, more than 300,000 people, and these are low-income groups and a lot of ethnic communities. Some of the communities, more than 80%, is of non-Dutch origin. So, a big challenge for an urban curator, but once you started your professional career, as some of my colleagues, and they were trained in the history of art, art objects. And I said, well, today it's time to get out into the neighborhoods. They said, Paul, I'm not trained to do that. I'm not going, I'm not passing the river, I'm not joining you in these neighborhoods. When I applied for my job, the former director said, good, you're an expert in bourgeois heritage, that's fine with me. But now that's different. So there are 4 different projects, and I will briefly discuss them with you. The first, the show starts, it's a little bit hard. It goes on, and when it's finished, I'll start again. We started with the so-called panorama project. You now see slides of this panorama project, and we did some research, and this research project was started by the educational department. And they said, we want to discuss the origins of several of these Rotterdam neighborhoods, because some of them belong to the most ethnic and cultural diverse places in Rotterdam. And they start doing interviews on schools, and they try to confront children with their heritage agenda. And in a few moments, and pay attention to the red circle, because I'm coming to that. When you see the red circle, it will come again, but pay attention to that, because it will come in my story. But these are all friends of Rotterdam South. So we represented all kinds of city panoramas in the urban neighborhoods. They collected stories and they turned them into kind of neighborhood panoramas, and these were presented in public spaces in these areas. Could be social welfare units, but shops as well. And the elderly people, they use these, you could say, participation moments in order, here, this is one. 5314, this is his number. Remember this number tattooed in his neck. I come to that. And because of the leading role of schools in this area, we asked children of elementary school, what is your favorite object and what kind of object do you want to give to the museum? And the interesting thing is, by doing that research, that when you ask people what is your favorite object and what is your object you want to give to the museum, that is the first time, especially for children in these neighborhoods, that they are confronted with the role and the meaning of heritage. Until now they are visiting the museum and they get confronted with, for instance, our temporary or permanent exhibitions, and they learn about the history of Rotterdam, but you can imagine that they're not really interested in the history of Rotterdam because their history is so different. And once you ask them, what is your favorite object? And will there be a time that you want to give it to the museum? We learned a lot about this presentation with these children because upon evaluating the project, we gained a lot of experience for our educational program. And these elements were used in further experiments. In particular, how new educational heritage programs are used, enable us to enhance social cohesion with personal related heritage as a key linkage factor. Secondly, we started the project ROFA 5314. And ROFA is Surinamese for Rotterdam. And our urban curator, she was a trained anthropologist, and she went into the neighborhoods and she saw all these graffiti signs 5314. And 5314 is nothing but an urban transport zone in Rotterdam South. But to the young ones, it's more than a transport zone, because they use that 5314 as their urban young identity. And that's why they tattoo this on their, in their necks, and they buy all different kind of clothes. So we wanted to get into contact with this social urban group. And but we know when we invite these groups to Rotterdam, to our museum, that it's difficult, especially if you realize that there is not just one 5314 group, but there are several groups. One of these groups is the group of, you could say, the hip-hop group. The second group they call urban young ones. They're dressed very different from other subgroups. And the third part, so it continues again, are, I think, perhaps a very interesting group, because these are the hooligans of the Feyenoord football club. And I don't know, have you ever met a hooligan? When you meet one guy, it's a nice guy. Perhaps not the favorite type for my daughter, but anyway. But when there are two of them, right, they start getting a little bit raw. When there are 3 or 4, then you have a gang. So in order to get into contact with them, we had an urban curator, and he was trained in karate, so he was not afraid. And they met each other on the Sunday morning, and because not in the football stadium, because all these hooligans were forbidden to go to the stadium. So we had to confront them into their own club, in their own atmosphere. And then we took photographs and we collected them. We almost stripped these hooligans. And nowadays, part of our collection of urban culture is based on our, you could say, created events. So we created events with all these young ones. When you look at these pictures, we rented an old grain factory in Rotterdam South, and we started a hip-hop party. And all these hip-hop guys were invited, 5314, and they all have this special, here, this is the favorite hooligan, 5314. And we arranged all kind of activities with them. And this is an urban hopper, and we came into contact. We collected their stories and so on. And It was very exciting because the curator was there at the entrance. And she said, well, I want this, yeah, this is typical for Rotterdam South. I want this clothes, I want that, and I want that. And I was there with my checkbook, and we paid there in cash. So we actually invited them, and we had, you could say, a collection market in an old grain factory. And it gave us a lot of attention. And that's why the third part of the triangle is about presentations. Meaning that when you're doing new kind of research, when you're confronting with urban heritage group, you have to look for different kind of presentations. So different from a classical presentations in a museum context. And we made all kind of magazines. The third model, this is the model I started myself with, is called the urban neighborhood model. And I said, I want to do a survey in one of the Rotterdam parts. And what I did, I said, I asked my assistants, we go random from streets to streets, and we call at every 10th door. So suppose I looked like a Jehovah Witness, and I came at every 10th door, I said, hello, I'm Paul van der Laar from the Museum of Rotterdam. And I want to ask you some questions. And as most people said, well, I'm not interested in this history of Rotterdam. I said, that's no big deal, because I'm not interested in telling you about the history of Rotterdam. And this was the restaurant I had there were headquarters. And so I started with these issues, and I started asking just simple questions about how do you come, why did you come to Rotterdam, when? What's your life? Where do you use shopping? May I take pictures of your furniture? May I take pictures of your kitchen? Where do your children go at school? And they asked me, why are you collecting this kind of story? I said, well, because our museum has to change. Because you are the visitors of the future. And when you say, I'm not interested in going to a museum at this very moment, I say, well, that's fine with me. No problem. But I want to make sure that once your children go to the museum, that they are confronted with their own history. I think so. I'm collecting for the future, not for the moment. And it was very interesting, and we did a lot of research. These three projects were combined, and we started 2 years ago a new project, and we called it the City as Muse. And all three elements, the panorama project, the urban neighborhood model, the RAFA experiments, were integrated into this model of the City of Muse. City as Muse. And it was the first time that we contracted an urban curator. And this urban curator, and because of our former projects, the National Foundation, the Mondrian Foundation, became so excited that they gave us money for 4 years and going on these experiments. We got a lot of media attention in this period, and nowadays we have the opportunity to attract an urban curator which operates in the areas. And one of our first projects is about women of the Velde. And the Velde is an area in Rotterdam South. It's a Rotterdam neighborhood that used to be one of the major landmarks of post-war welfare society. However, this housing area proved not to be suitable as a living area for the intercultural society, and this area is going to be restructured. And the interesting thing is that she came across a group of women, because these women did not sit down. Most of these women are alone, and they didn't want to sit down passively and await the uncertain future. They said, we're going to join forces, and they started an informal group, and they call it Vrouwen van der Velden, the women of the Velde, and the Velden, that's the name of the neighborhood. And they started these weekly informal breakfast meetings. And our curator joined every week. He went to these breakfast communities, and during these breakfast meetings they discussed all kinds of social activities, problems with the children, the ways to help other parents in raising their children and so on. And we cataloged the story, we took pictures, and so on, and said, what kind of presentations are we going to make with these women? And said, well, what we do, and we asked several curators and specialists, we're going to create a glossy. So we created a glossy, and we're going to call it Every Woman. And perhaps you don't know, but Every Woman is a song by, I believe, Whitney Houston and, well, yes, that's one. Yes, thank you, Matt. Every Woman. And so we made a magazine, and we interviewed them, and we really made a very glossy magazine. And you can imagine that these women, when you look at the front page, and it will come in the next 3 slides, there it is, there will be the front cover of this. This is the glossy, Every Woman, Together You're Strong. And that was the first time, so they had their glossy, and all these stories, this is the picture of the neighborhood, and all these stories were catalogued. Here are these stories about these different stories, and they are very conflicting stories. When you read these stories, how do you survive in this kind of neighborhood when you have not very much money? Some of them lost their, this is the breakfast table, and this is our urban curator, Irene, joining for breakfast every week. And in this way we confronted, you could say, the issue of the Vrouwen van de Velde with all kind of collection in our collection of portraits of former members of the bourgeois, Rotterdam bourgeois. And following this program, we asked, this is particularly relevant, we asked artists to use all these material in turning them into, you could say, the heritage project in a kind of public performance. Because we like to work with artists, because artists have one thing in common, they are great observers. And a lot of the aspects of modern day society, they are able to turn it into, you could say, a new kind of installations, artistic expressions, and so on. This program, City as Muse, will be evaluated thoroughly in next year. But I think that the responses are positive until now. Because these experiments are used in order to, you could say, to turn Museum Rotterdam, and that's why we skipped the name from Historical Museum into Museum Rotterdam. The same, by the way, is done in Amsterdam. And we say that we want to transform our museum in a network museum. Meaning that we use our headquarters, our small headquarters, and we hope to get a better headquarters. But we are kind of the museum, you could say, is one of the particulars in a network of all kind of community representations. That means that we already listen to your lessons. Make sure that you be flexible, that you can respond on the new challenges of heritage communities. Conclusion. First of all, I started with telling you that the heritage task of city museums, I believe, and especially in 21st city museums, working in transnational situations. I think that our heritage task is very different from art museums. And because we're different, that we have to reconsider our point of view. Meaning that we should not just accept the standards of museums, because all standards are based on the standards of art historical paradigms. We are dealing with cohesion heritage. That doesn't mean that we should not use heritage in order to confront communities, but we use it because it's the other way around. Because when, and yet has said it beautifully, this, when it's light and easy, it's not interesting. So it means that cohesion can be very hard, but you know, you can, in order to confront people, you make it part of their own history. So I believe that's very important. And of course this new concept is relevant because city museums, and David Fleming of the Liverpool Museum already started his program 10 years ago. He said we have to move, become agents of social changes and break up the city museum's wall, end of quote. Reframing our heritage mission is thus essential, and more energy and effort are needed to mobilize communities. So the future urban curator, in my opinion, will be a kind of heritage broker, an intermediary between the public and the museum. But in the end, perhaps you won't tell the difference between the public and the museum. That will be the best. Of course, and this is the caveat, you should be aware, and this is a serious matter, because when Irene started to join these breakfast meetings, that you have to take care that you not become a social therapist. Because your working field is quite different for somebody who's entertaining and acting as a social therapist. Within the 21st century communities, we should be entitled to share their expertise with professionals. And I believe that museums need to follow this path to enlarge their representativeness. And that was exactly the purpose of our heritage experiments in our Rotterdam case. You can imagine the impact. When I went to this leader restaurant and I said to him, may I use your restaurant, this Turkish restaurant, as my office for the next month? Would you mind that I come here every Wednesday with my staff and have lunch here? And would you mind taking care of, when this program is finished, then I want to invite all people in this neighborhood, and I want you to cater for them. I want you to run this community barbecue. And of course I said, well, I can invite you to the museum, but the better way is that I organize it in your shop, then you can earn money by it. So he said, well, of course. I said, it's a little bit strange, somebody from the museum, but yeah, if you pay, I said, I pay. No problem. So the purpose of these heritage experiments was in order to show that you can be representative. The heritage program has become a continuation of, you could say, the participation concept, which has been addressed by former speakers this day. But I want to stress is based on a profound knowledge of local situations by close observations of communities, places and interactions. And these close anthropological observations help urban curators addressing greater themes on social inequality or migration processes. I want to stress that knowledge and expertise is essential. City curators can thus learn a lot from the urban anthropologists and urban historians who are studying the effects of transnationalism. I think they should work together. So I think that urban historians at the university and urban curators at the city museums should form this kind of transnational programs in order to link the transnational visual culture, visual history, with, you could say, the mental maps of this new urban context. And I hope by joining these forces we come into grips of the meaning, the essential of what does mental heritage mean for our future heritage program. And in this way pave the way for a new city heritage paradigm. Of course, I realize there are still many problems unsolved. Perhaps we have to accept in some cases that urban intercultural institutions are better equipped for the job, because their experiments are public driven and less based on transmission of knowledge traditionally assigned to museums. For instance, in the Netherlands we've got the imaginative in Amsterdam, Cosmopolis Rotterdam in Rotterdam. And these institutions are very successful in bridging the gap between diversity, different cultures and a diverse Dutch population, even in the most backward areas of Dutch large cities. The fact that these centers are not museums and thus do not have the explicit task of safeguarding the past stimulates and enables it to offer a flexible urban cultural program. However, it makes sense to set up an intensive cooperation between city museums, these institutions, and jointly face the opportunities of exploring, safeguarding memories, working memories, as part of a new heritage program, which is based on social bonding in a complex transnational urban setting. Because we have to link, if we not succeed as urban city museums to link the material, the intangible, tangible, and the mental heritage, and confront them in a museum, then you can perhaps say that there is no future role for us as city museums, and then we will you could say, centers of nostalgia. You can say, what is wrong about that? Nothing. But won't expect that the public funding and the urban community will be willing to pay for it in the future. So I think that personally I believe it's a new challenge. I'm not doing this because out of public funding. I'm doing it because I think it's so exciting. And when you've seen this case study, I can imagine that you love to join me on one of my trips. Thank you very much.